if you go online, Paul, you might see the simple advice of just buying an S&P 500 index fund and riding that for a long time. What about that as a strategy? Maybe pros and cons with that situation.
Well, I think that's a great idea, by the way. The S&P 500, excuse me, we have evidence going back to 1926. By the way, there was no S&P 500 in 1926, but the academic community has created. How would you have done if somebody had put that 500 companies together? And by the way, it's not the same 500 companies because over the years, many of those companies that were great in the 20s and the 30s virtually disappeared. And so it's an index that is created based on what we know about the past. And again, we have this problem, you can't buy the past, but what do we know? We know that for long periods of time, the compound rate of return of that very high quality index, it's the highest quality, has been about 10%. And that's great because you can double your money about every 7 years when you are able to achieve a 10% compound rate of return. Now, if you looked at other asset classes that are also have been studied by the academics and also built indexes just like the S&P 500, but for these different asset classes, some of those asset classes make 11, some make 12, some make 13. So then the question is, well, wouldn't I want to have some of those other asset classes? But the reason the S&P 500 makes people feel so secure is people know at least the biggest companies in the S&P 500 are there. So there's a sense of trust. It's just like most Americans want to invest in U.S. securities because we know the system and we have a sense of trust. Well, for what it's worth, the people in Greece have an affinity to the Greek companies. So this is not uncommon that we are focused on the country, the market that we come from, and it's okay. But I know this. I know that if you're able to have some of those other asset classes in your portfolio, historically, that return goes up anywhere from 1 to 2% and even more. And if I could help a young person in the equity part of their portfolio make an extra 1 to 2%, and then I would be able to also say, and actually not take more risk. I mean, this is the part that is so amazing is that as you add these other equity asset classes, that it does not increase the risk by any meaningful, measurable amount. And you can say, well, how could that possibly be? Well, think about the S&P 500. The reason we feel comfortable with it is because there's 500 companies, not one. And some of them are going to fail. We know that from the past. So diversification makes sense. And the academics teach us that diversification amongst different equity asset classes is actually more impactful and more meaningful than whether you have 100 or 200 or 300 large cap growth companies. So it's all there for the taking. And what's new about it, Andy, is what we've discovered over the last 60 years. I am 80. I have been around this industry since the mid 60s. When I was a first-time investor and came into the industry, there were no load mutual funds, or there were a couple, but people paid 8.5% load to get in. Everybody believed in active management because there was no such thing as an index fund. We didn't have ETFs. We didn't have target date funds. We didn't have low-cost funds like we have today. In fact, Andy, investing has never been more efficient, never been as client-centric as it is today. That's the good news. And I'll end with the bad news. The bad news is there are a lot of really evil people who are trying to get you to do something with your money that is not in your best interest, and they are masterful at getting to us. So you and we're trying to educate people so they build a wall to protect themselves from those bad bad people.
Yeah, yeah. I've experienced a lot of that. I experienced some of that in the beginning of my investing journey, not knowing much at all and putting a lot of money in the hands of someone who was more concerned about the commission they were going to get than the direction I needed to go in my late 20s for my portfolio.
But
And
that's human
it's a
nature.
shame. It is human nature. And
And
we have to realize that, right, Paul? And we have to realize the
yes,
motivation.
and they knew how to motivate you to say the right things. They
Yeah.
actually take a try. I went through the training. I was a stockbroker for
Ah,
a little over
okay.
2 years back in the 60s.
Yeah.
And you are trained to ask the right questions to get people to respond with yes, and the final yes is the ask for the order. And it's not that it's evil because it's part of the process. But what's important here is never has education about investing been more important, because pensions are not going to be a way for people to have money. Social Security may not give us what we're going to need. And so we're on our own in a way. Let's make sure that we're acting in our own best interest.
I love it. Yes, I am a son of someone who has the pension. Very jealous of what he's got, but I'm very, very happy for him,
Good
of
for them.
course. But I need to make my own pension. So let's talk about how we can modify this portfolio and talk about your four fund portfolio. This is getting slightly more complicated, but again, not too complicated for people who are going down this path of DIY investing and realizing that this can be done well through index fund investing and automation. So talk to us about four fund.
So let me talk about a two fund and a four fund strategy. A little
Sure.
different two fund strategy than the target date fund. Let's just look at investing in individual ETFs, exchange traded funds, or mutual funds. The two ways you can do it and get almost the same long-term return. Go back to that 10% return from the S&P 500. You could actually build a portfolio that combines the S&P 500 and small cap value. And let me suggest something radical, that you have half of your money in the S&P 500 and half of your money in small cap value. Now that combination has historically produced about 2% more than the S&P 500. And here's the part that's fascinating, that if you look at all of the negative years since 1970 for the two fund strategy and the S&P 500, and you added up all those years that they lost money, because they did lose about 25% of the time, the S&P 500 lost more than the combination. And how can that be? Because these two equity asset classes don't go up and down together. And there are years small cap value does really well and the S&P 500 actually loses money. So this is magic when you can put together two asset classes. Now, if you used four asset classes, and they're easy to identify, the S&P 500, large cap value for 25% each of those two, 25% in small cap blend, that means some value and some growth, and 25% in small cap value. Those four funds over the last 96 years have made 1.8% better than the S&P 500. And here is what is so absolutely marvelous is we have what we call a quilt chart that you can see the returns 1 year at a time since 1928. I love numbers. And you can compare those four different asset classes 1 year at a time. What was number one? What was number four? And you'll see this amazing difference from the top to the bottom. You have to ask yourself, is that the same stock market? How can one be up 22 and the other one's down 7? Well, that's the way the market actually works. And people need to understand that volatility, that randomness. But the four fund strategy, never at the top, never at the bottom. Basically, right hanging right there in the middle because it's the average of these four great long-term great equity asset classes. And so instead of having something that's bouncing all over the place, you could, in essence, you could select the one that is close to the middle. Now, that means you never get to be number one, and that means you never get to be number four or five, if you want to look at it in that way. And that's okay, because what we are looking for is a return that will meet our needs with as little volatility as possible. And the only thing I can't stamp on that comment is the word guaranteed.
Absolutely.
But you and I are both committed to making sure people buy cheaper index funds that leave more money in your pocket. That doesn't guarantee you're going to be number one. There's going to be some active money manager out there that's probably going to beat the index. In fact, over 20 years, about 1 in 10 managers is able to beat the index. The problem is you can't find them beforehand. You don't know who they're going to be. So I know that we're both on the right path. The question is, how do we reach people? You're reaching them. And how do we present the information that they get it? Not from I'm not going to say I'm not a salesperson, but I have no income generated out of the work that we do. And the bottom line is that we're simply trying to get people the best that we know, but then you got to see the information to make that judgment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now there's somebody listening and they hear the variety of funds you're talking about in this equity four fund portfolio. And they're thinking, well, what about just buying a total stock market index fund, Paul? Isn't that the same thing? Can you tell us why it's not or why it is?
Well, I can tell you why it is. In fact, the actual return, again, done by the academics, of the total market index going back to 1928 is a little bit under the S&P 500. They're virtually the same investment over the long term. And the reason they are is because they are cap weighted returns. And so the very big companies in both the total market index and the S&P 500 are driving most of that return that you see every year. So either one of those are fine. But what, of course, the total market people will say is, well, yeah, but we have some small cap value and we have some small cap growth. What they don't tell you, and they know, is that historically small cap growth has been a lousy investment and has compounded at a little over 8 versus about 13 for small cap value. Okay? You put those together, which they've done, you have eliminated the advantage of small cap value. And so what happens is you end up getting a return that's virtually the same as the S&P 500. If they would just build that total market index so it didn't have any small cap growth, it would improve the return of that portfolio. But the reason that I like being able, and what we do on our site, is we tell you what ETFs, we have what we call best in class ETFs, so people can decide, yes, I want to be this kind of an investor. Oh, and here are the mutual funds or ETFs that I should use, so that you can really be a do-it-yourself investor. But the reality is that even when you talk about small cap value, there's a huge range in small cap value funds. A lot of people don't know it, but there are 6 major indexes that call themselves small cap value. And the difference in return over the last 15 years, on average, is 2.5% a year. Well, that tells me somebody
Wow.
needs to spend some time to figure out, why did some end up towards the top and some ended up towards the bottom?
Yeah.
That's not true with the total market index or the S&P 500. They're all kind of the same except for what the expenses are. But it is true about these asset classes that the portfolios are put together in different ways. And that means they have different long-term rates of return. And our desire, and what I'm recommending for people to do is the same that my wife and I did for our newborn granddaughter a couple of years ago. We put money away for her retirement, and we divided the money between a S&P 500 like fund and a small cap value fund, and we picked the best two that we could, that's there to serve her for the next 90 to 100 years.
I love that. I love that.